Let me ask about Congress and its role in protecting individual rights. Do you think Congress or the Supreme Court has played a more effective role in the protection of individual rights?
Very interestingly, I think Congress deserves very high marks in protecting the individual rights of American people, ranging from the very enactment of the Bill of Rights at the founding of the Republic, protecting the magisterial freedoms that Americans cherish, and through the course of history, proposing amendments to the Constitution that have gone a long way to protect Americans' liberties with respect to the franchise, for example, for African Americans, for women, and others. And so Congress, which is often derided as a body uninterested in the protection of our rights, has indeed performed very, very well. It's difficult to compare the two institutions because the Supreme Court, on many landmark occasions, has rendered decisions. Americans are familiar with them. Brown versus the Board of Education, for example, that has gone a long way to protect civil rights and civil liberties. On the other hand, the court's record is checkered because the court has rendered decisions which have undermined the civil rights of the American people, and we can look at the Japanese internment questions as a very good example of that. So mixed record on the part of both Congress and the court.
You mentioned Congress's ability to propose constitutional amendments, or they proposed the Bill of Rights. You mentioned the Civil Rights Acts of the 1960s. Are there any other significant acts of Congress that protected individual rights which are worth identifying here?
I think, yes. I think generally speaking, in the area of criminal law, we've seen Congress pass legislation that has protected important rights of Americans. We can see privacy, for example, where Congress has enacted laws. We can see a number of areas, but at the same time, it has to be said that Congress can just as easily encroach on the rights and liberties of the American people as the court can.
Given that the Congress is to be responsible to its constituents, what is the role of constituents, in this case I'll call the private sector, in the creation of legislation supporting individual rights?
Very, very important role. To be a citizen in the United States is to imply that we are all legislators. And so American citizens have the opportunity to propose all kinds of ideas for the protection of rights and liberties through the process of contacting their representatives in the House and the Senate, for playing a larger role in being part of an interest group or a great cause, for example, with respect to the passage of civil rights in the civil rights bills in the 1960s, so that we're talking about the Civil Rights Act of 1964, or indeed the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which were pushed very hard and championed very hard by individual rights and by individual members of our society who in some ways had to push Congress very hard to get on board. So American citizens can, in fact, play a very great role in the effort to expand their own rights and liberties.
What about the executive branch's role in introducing proposed legislation? Obviously, the president can. Can you discuss that process?
Sure. Presidents can do that. They have done that frequently. There are some high water marks in the history of the United States. President Lyndon Johnson certainly was a champion of civil rights legislation in the mid-60s. He used the great power of his office at his own great political peril in advancing the Civil Rights Act of '64 and the Voting Rights Act of '65. In fact, he was very candid in saying that he believed that it would mark an end to the solid democratic South, and he was certainly right about that. But as he said, what's the point of having power if you can't do the right thing?
Obviously, the executive can, as you just said, propose legislation, but it also then shapes legislation that the Congress passes. Can you talk about that?
Certainly the president has a great opportunity to shape the nature of the legislation through politics, through the opportunity to offer incentives to members of Congress to push legislation that might provide particular projects, water projects, defense bases in the home district of a member of a House, or indeed in a particular state to curry favor with senators. So the formal power of the president to do so is great, but the informal power through the incentives and patronage that can be exercised by the White House gives the president additional tools to shape legislation that he supports.
And what are the functions of executive orders?
Executive orders have played a very important role in our history. Students need to understand that executive orders in the most fundamental way represent a tool that the president uses to govern the executive branch. But presidents have used those tools in a way that it's captured a great deal of attention in the press and indeed have made history. And many of them have not, in fact, been viewed in a positive light. Consider, for example, President Roosevelt in 1942 issuing Executive Order 9066 to essentially intern Japanese Americans in camps, to remove them from their homes and to place them in camps in Western states. Congress did pass a statute to support the executive order, so both responsibility and perhaps blame was placed on both branches of government. Indeed, the Supreme Court of the United States upheld the executive order and the statute, but of course, historically, that has been one of the most regrettable examples of the issuance of an executive order. And the United States Congress in the late 1980s did pass compensation to apologize, essentially, to those victims of the internment process. Another good example of an executive order occurred during the presidency of Harry Truman, when he issued an executive order to take control of the steel mills in order to protect against what he feared to be a nationwide strike that would undermine the ability of the United States to protect steel, to carry out its foreign policy, national security objectives. The Supreme Court rebuked the president's claim of authority to seize the steel mills. So there are many examples of the use of executive orders carried out by presidents that have drawn a great deal of attention and incited a great deal of controversy.